Greetings, I'm John Duvall. Welcome to today's Truth Factor discussion. The time we come together every week to factor the truth of God's wonderful Word into our daily lives. Good morning, gentlemen. How are you all doing? Daniel, let's change things up and start with you.
I'm doing wonderful, thank you, brother, and just want to appreciate everyone who's joined us in the chat room for your time, and we ask you to grab a Bible, whether you have an electronic edition or a written edition, just being able to follow along in God's Word, and please feel free to comment or ask any questions that you have.
Very good, very good. Paul, how about yourself?
I'm doing great and certainly glad to see everyone here. Look forward to our study today. Tom?
Yeah. I'm doing fine out here in California. Obviously, I've got a cold, and so my voice is rough. I'll probably limit my comments today, which is probably a relief to everybody. We are in the midst of a gospel meeting right now, and we have Don Brady. He's not joining me today, but he's listening in today, and we have a gospel meeting going on here in Bellflower, and having a good week. So if you're in the area, we would be more than honored for you to be with us through Friday night at 7:30 each evening. But looking forward to our study as always.
All right. Seth, it's good to have you back with us this week. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing great. I'm up traveling in Tennessee, back where I grew up. Leaves are changing colors. It's beautiful. Feeling cool air for once is actually a relief. Living in Florida and living in perfect weather all the time, it gets old. I don't know if that's been your experience yet, Daniel, being in Hawaii or not, but I enjoy getting where it's a little chilly again every now and then. I'm here. I'm visiting with one of my good friends, Eric Reynolds. He preaches here where my grandparents live in Fayetteville, Tennessee, where I'm visiting. So I'll turn it over to Eric.
I'm certainly glad to be joining you guys for this study. I'm Eric Reynolds. I grew up in Athens, Alabama, and I met Seth when I was in college at Tennessee Tech, where he was a young man at the time. And I'm now preaching at the South Fayetteville Church of Christ in Fayetteville, Tennessee, and I'm glad to be joining you for this study.
Well, it's good to have you with us, Eric. I'm glad you could sit in this morning and be the host there for Seth at your location and joining us for our study as well. All righty. It just dawned on me, Paul, that I failed to start the audio-only channel, so give me just a second, and we will have that underway here.
That sounds good, John. I'll just mention that while we're here, that it take a few moments to open up to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. I believe we'll be beginning down around verse 17, as we'll start talking about Paul addressing another topic we see now, and so that tells us that he has some things to say about yet another problem that was present at Corinth, and we'll be studying there in 1 Corinthians 11, and I believe down around verse 17 as we begin today.
That's right. Yep, that's where we will begin. And Paul, you're right. I'm looking at the playback, and the video on my end is not very...
Not to get caught up in the technical things, but John, it's we're not getting a high-definition signal from you either.
Yep, I know it's wrong. I tell you what, give me, y'all hang on for just about 1 minute, and I'll be right back, and we'll jump right into the study, and I think I can solve the issue.
Okay. For those of you watching, let's go ahead and turn over there to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And as we look there, I'm going to ask Tom to read here in just a moment. I'm turning the old-fashioned paper Bible. And Tom, why don't you read, while we wait for John, why don't we go ahead and read verses 17 through 22?
Okay, yeah, we can do.
You want to do that, or would you rather not today?
Oh, no, that's fine. I can do that, I think. Let's see how my voice does with this. So,
okay.
Okay, so Paul begins, now in giving these instructions, I do not praise you, since you come together not for the better, but for the worst. For first of all, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and in part I believe it. For there must be factions among you, that those who are approved may be recognized among you. Therefore, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in eating, each one takes his own supper ahead of the others, and one is hungry and another is drunk. What? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I do not praise you.
John, we just went ahead while you were away and read verses 17 through 22, and I'll hand back over to you.
Oh, that sounds good. I appreciate y'all doing that. Paul, I heard you mention just before I signed off there that he uses the terminology or the word now, as you pointed out there, now in giving these instructions. It is interesting that right off the bat he says, I do not praise you, since you come together not for the better, but for the worse. You know, in saying something that is very, seemingly very simple, we find that it is very important. Imagine telling a congregation that, folks, when you come together on the first day of the week to worship God, you really aren't coming together but for the better. You're coming together for the worse. The wrong reasons, the wrong motives, the wrong attractions, if you would. And as we read through this here, we'll kind of see exactly the problem here that he was discussing. I mean, that should be a slap in the face for any preacher to stand up to a congregation and saying, I perceive you're coming together not for better reasons, but for worse reasons. But Paul, with the authority, was able to make that statement.
Yeah, I think that's right, John. I was going to just mention that I was doing some comparative reading, and in the New International Version, and I hope this is not the 2011, but I'm hoping that it reads the same. He says there, in the following directives, I have no praise for you, for your meetings do more harm than good. And I thought that was an interesting way of phrasing that. And later on, when he talks about not to eat the Lord's Supper, he says that's not that when you come together that you're not accomplishing what you set out to do. And we'll look at that verse in a minute. But that particular translation says they come together for more harm than good.
Yeah, for your
I think 2011 says the same thing too.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's, you know, oftentimes we talk about what makes a sound church and what makes an unsound church. And when we talk about worship and our worship being that which we offer to God, this goes to show that if, in the example of the Lord's Supper, if we're not observing it as God is so instructed, the worship we offer to Him, He does not accept. And not only that, it ends up spiritually harming the congregation, as we'll see as we go through here.
Well, when Jesus quoted from the Old Testament about I really think he probably had the Pharisees in mind when he did that. We apply it to many things today as well. But in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. When our practices are just merely man-made ideas, what we want to do, God is not pleased, and He rejects that. People say, you think people are wasting their time? I really do. I think that people can be wasting their time thinking that they're worshiping when they're really not.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And something else that I see in that expression that I'm just reminded of is he talks about how we are coming together as a church, which you know, there's something to be said about the assembling together, you know, and while we certainly don't have time to discuss it here, but the nature of the church is involved in that. You know, I mean, while we are members of the church at all times, there is a distinction between when we assemble and when we are not assembled. You know, some argue that what the church can do, the individual can do. What the individual can do, the church can do. You know, passages such as this make a distinction between those things.
Okay.
Well, and you know, there are many just critical scholars that try to break up the book of 1 Corinthians and say it's different letters, but as we've continued to see throughout each chapter is that there's one theme that really underlies the whole entire letter, and I'm sure there's many themes that you can come up with, but he's dealing with an attitude of individuals who feel they are free to do anything since they have been redeemed by Christ. And the fact is that just because you have been bought, just because you're free, doesn't mean you could just do whatever you want. The fact is, when it comes, and in this instance for the worship of God, that you have to do things as God has instructed, not just any way that you please.
Okay. That almost harkens back a little bit to the previous chapter. I mean, at least part of what he was dealing with there.
Yeah, and that's the attitude that he's fighting, is all things are lawful for me, and Paul's answer is no. Let's qualify that statement.
Yeah, exactly. And at the same time, we also see that worship is something that you enter into. We have some today who are advocating that everything you do is worship. And while we understand that everything we do is service to God, worship is a time that you enter into according to this text here.
Tom, there's something about that and I've looked at that, and I think that my understanding is that sometimes that debate, and I've heard some pretty powerful arguing about that, that debate seems to almost be, like you say, it's a defining of some terms.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking about the collective worship that we enter into as a church,
right?
Or whether we're talking about our everyday acknowledgement of who God is and His right to direct our lives, that we are servants of His in all things. And so if we just clearly define those terms, that doesn't seem to have to be such a bitter controversy among brethren.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. I totally agree with that. But sometimes the argument, they use that as when, again, they talk about what the church can do, the individual can do. I mean, and a lot of times it's used to expand the work of the church.
And also, when they say all life is worship, usually what they're trying to do is lower worship, not elevate the rest of their life. They're trying to say, well, let's not give our best when we go to worship, because all life is worship. So they're trying to lower the worship service down to the standard that they're living in the rest of their life, instead of raising their lives to an attitude of worship constantly. They usually aren't arguing to raise their life up, rather to lower worship when that happens. And this idea of division, when dealing with division, Paul has been dealing with throughout the entire letter as well. People talking, putting their own individuality above the collective good. From chapter 1, saying, "I am of Paul, I am of Apollos." Chapter 3, verse 3, "Are you still fleshly? Since there is jealousy and strife among you." There's been this discussion about the divisions that they're having and fighting for some sort of individuality that really shouldn't be a part of the work of the church.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Well, let me ask you this then, Seth, as we kind of move, segueing into verse 18, and we talk a little bit about the divisions. When he says in the first part of verse 18, "For first of all, when you come together as a church," now he is now clearly, would you say, talking about an act of worship that is done when the local congregation comes together?
Oh, first, the word church here simply means assembly. So whenever you gather together as an assembly, it has to have some sort of, he's not just saying when you come together, He's not saying the exact same thing back to back. There is a purpose to saying as a church, as an assembly, that there is a special time when you do come together that is set apart than just getting together for a burger or getting together for something else. There is a special time set apart when they are coming together as a collective group, but this collective group is really there are divisions in the middle of it, that there are cracks in this whole that needs to be taken care of.
See, that's what I find even more so disturbing about the situation. He's not simply addressing divisive attitudes. I mean, he's already done that. But here he's talking about in the worship service, there's even division present. And we're going to see this division being manifested in a couple different ways, including the differences in who can do what, and therefore who's better than what. And because I can't do this, I'm not a part of the body. Because you can't do this, you're not a part of the body. Imagine a worship service where the very worship service itself possesses attitude of divisiveness among the brethren.
And there seems to be a little bit of irony in that verse as well, in that he says when you come together, there are divisions, which are kind of the opposite.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, but
I didn't catch that, but you're right.
And here we really see a danger we've got to look out for when we look at if anything's really going to attack the church and cause damage and harm to the church. You know, before we started broadcasting, we were talking about different things that are happening in Texas and different ways that we may see as persecution. But when churches divide, it's usually not because there's an outside source attacking the church. It's like what Paul tells the Ephesian elders, that ravenous wolves are going to come among your number, and even some of you, the elders themselves, will be the cause of the divisions that are going to happen in the church.
That's right. And what I think is an interesting, if this is historically accurate, Ignatius, one of the quote-unquote, as some call them, church fathers, in around the turn of the 1st century, he wrote a series of letters, and in his letters he addressed them to the bishop, elders, deacons. And one of the letters he wrote was to the church at Ephesus. And so it's very likely that either the church at Ephesus had a ruling bishop by the end of the 1st century, or he just assumed that they did. You know, and if they did, Paul's warning was, was spot on. He knew what was going to happen. I don't know, that was interesting to kind of look at that, that letter there and see what he wrote.
I'd like to just mention that I really appreciate Eric's comment because,
yes.
I've read this I don't know how many times, and that just never struck me quite that way. The irony that Paul's talking about, and if you remove the phrases there, the prepositional phrases, when you come together, there are divisions. It's just these people just had their the church at Corinth, the way in which they treated one another, everything just so backwards that it doesn't even. It's almost hard to create a sentence that describes them.
That's right. That's right. Well, there's something I want to talk about, but I think I'm going to hold it off later. Kind of file away in the back of our mind the statement here, when you come together as a church. And just for right now, we'll keep within our mindset. He's talking about the assembly when they've come together to worship the Heavenly Father. And because he's talking about the divisions that exist. So I don't want to walk away from that too quickly. It is an interesting phrase when he says, and in part I believe it. Paul says, I believe what I have heard about you. And when you think about his journeys, if I remember correctly from our studies, he wrote, remind me now, help me here if I'm off base. Didn't he write this letter while he was in Ephesus during his 3rd journey?
Yeah, it is believed that he did. Yes.
Okay. That's kind of what I was thinking. The point is that the Ephesian congregation was still relatively young. I'd say relatively young, 3, 4, 5 years, maybe, but yet old enough that Paul knew them well enough and believed the report. And so let's look at the report a little bit farther. There in verse 19, he says, "For there must also be factions among you, that those who are approved may be recognized among you." The English Standard Version, for whatever is worth, says, "For there must be factions among you in order that those who are genuine among you may be recognized." Now, it sounds more like a rhetorical statement, but what do you think he's saying here? Daniel, I'll throw it to you.
Yeah, I know one option is that he's quoting them. For instance, one translation will render "for" and in quotation mark, "dissensions are unavoidable," end quotation. "It is claimed among you in order that those who are tried and true among you may be visibly revealed." And so maybe in part he's quoting something from them that they're saying, well, the reason that there's divisions among us is just that they're unavoidable in that sense, that they're just bound to happen, as somewhat an excuse for these things, when Paul in actuality is wanting to address this in order to solve these problems, because divisions are not going to be helpful, are not going to be they're going to be harmful for the cause of Christ, for the worship more specifically in this instance. And when you're trying to focus on Jesus and what he did for everyone, yet you're trying to single out you specifically, it seems like a contradictory message that you're sending to everyone.
I hadn't really thought of that from the angle of it possibly being a quote from something that they had said to try to excuse themselves. But Seth, what do you think?
I agree with that's a great way to look at it. There must be factions. I could see that easily being something that he's quoting the report as saying.
Another possibility, kind of along those lines, but not without quoting them, is that it's hard to tell when in 1 Corinthians Paul is being, I don't know if sarcastic is the right word, but some would read that as that he's saying that sarcastically, that, well, of course you have to have division so that those who are true will be identified. I don't know if it's hard to be sure, but if he is, the reason why we would think that perhaps he's not being just take it at surface value, there has to be division, is because he says in chapter 1 he doesn't want there to be any division. So that makes you wonder, why is he now saying there must be divisions, and is he saying that in a rhetorical or ironic sort of way, or quoting them? I think that's the reason why we kind of consider these other possible meanings.
All right, that's a good point. That's a good point. He clearly is not approving of it.
Right.
So he's got to be doing something else. All right. Tom, what do you think?
Oh, did you say Tom? Because I was. Oh, yeah, I was going to make an observation. And I totally agree with all that. One thing I see there is, if you can say good comes out of a division, and there's no way we want to say good comes out of a division, but sometimes it identifies people's real motives, and sometimes it identifies those that are not intent on following the truth.
Okay.
So I mean, a lot of times a division exposes, it's not good. Clearly, period. It's not good. But with divisions, a lot of times you come out of that division stronger.
Okay. All right.
Because those that are factious leave, if they leave.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
and sadly it happens. And like I said,
Wouldn't you say it's almost like separating the wheat from the chaff in some ways?
yeah.
Paul, do you have any thoughts before we talk a little bit more about this?
Well, as we look at this, I was thinking about the phrase in connection with this that Paul uses there. He says that in verse 18 that in part he believes it. Mm-hmm. And I know I was doing some comparative reading, and one translation says to some extent. I wonder if Paul is trying to express to them that I hear there's divisions, and I think there, if I can do a rough paraphrase here, that I think there are some of you who really are divisive people. That's the in part. And Paul says that when he talks about that there were some, that he said there must be divisions among you, that there is a difference between people who are genuinely serving God and those who had self-seeking motives. There were obviously in this partaking, I don't want to jump way down the line here, but there were also some in this partaking who said, you know what, we're here, we're going to take this, and who cares about everybody else? Me and my buddies, we're going to partake of this, and if there's some people who aren't here yet, well, they can go buy some more. They can have their own. And so I think that he's saying there must be divisions because there's some people with those nasty attitudes, and that's not the attitude of Christ. And so there must be divisions. That there are some of you who are genuinely serving God, but there's a real problem with some people with some very divisive spirits. In part, I believe there's divisions.
Okay, all right. One, I wanted to share this with you because I don't agree with it. The English Standard Study Bible puts an interesting point regarding this verse. They write, in God's providential direction of the life of the church, he allowed controversy in order that the genuine spiritual quality of individual believers would be known. And so I thought that was kind of interesting that they wrote that. I'm not going to so much say, if I was going to say what I thought on it, I would almost go towards more along the lines of what Eric brought out, that this might be a more of a rhetorical statement, and kind of like what Paul was putting out there. The end result of these factions is that you really see who the genuine individuals are. But he's definitely not commending them for it, but more looking at, if nothing else, the result of it. The result of these factions is to show who's genuinely serving God. I got a hint from Seth a while ago that we have a comment in the chat room.
Yes.
So it looks like Seth already has that for sharing, Paul. So if you do you want to read that?
I'll be happy to. Brian says, "It seems to me that the clause to the statement, 'there must be factions,' is that those who are approved must be evident. This would suggest to me that this is not a quote or a play on terms, but a genuine point in line with many of the points Paul makes on apostasy. As Jesus said, 'You will know them by their fruit.'"
All right. So more, it sounds like what Brian is saying there. It's more the idea of here's the result of these factions is you'll see who are genuine. If you see who's genuine, you also see who is not genuine. Seth, I'm watching the replay on that, and we may share that a little bit bigger.
Okay.
Let me kind of illustrate how big I've got it on mine, just so for the recording purposes, it might be a bit more visible.
Oh, okay. So
When we think about what Paul is saying here, you know that when in other occasions he talks about those who are divisive, and that reject a divisive man after the first and second admonition. Paul is making a division there, that there are some people who ought to be rejected because of their
That's right.
divisive spirit. And you know, other occasions when we're told to mark or to handle someone who's unfaithful or whatever, we're given some latitude and we're given some freedom to decide. But you notice with a divisive man, there's no tolerant level hardly at all. He says a first and second admonition. You warn him once, you warn him twice, and he is identified and rejected as a divisive man because of the great danger that it has to the church. Paul here is saying that there is that. I like what Brian said. There is that division there.
Yeah. Well, even in Romans 16:17, I appeal to you, brothers, to watch out for those who cause divisions and create obstacles contrary to the doctrine that you've been taught. Avoid them. And he continues there. So definitely a good connection there. Let's jump back over to the chat room again. We've got, let's see, Seth, you want me to share that, or do you got a little bigger?
Does that work?
Let's see. Yeah, let's give that a whirl. I've got mine just a little bit bigger, but let's test that on the. There you go. Yeah, that'll work.
I'm sorry. I was supposed to read that, I think. Randall says, I'm just sitting here. Randall says, he quotes 2 Peter chapter 2 and verses 1 through 3. That wasn't Randall. That's Peter actually saying that. But he tells us about it. He says, "But false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will be false prophets among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, and bringing upon themselves swift destruction. And many will follow their sensuality, and because of them the way of truth will be blasphemed. And in their greed they will exploit you with false words. Their condemnation is from long ago, is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep."
Right.
I appreciate that, Paul. And I think that's a good point. What is interesting about what Randall has just quoted for us is Paul isn't so much addressing these individuals as false teachers, but the end result of the divisiveness is the same as the false teachers. I mean, when you look at what Peter wrote, we're jumping forward, what would you say, maybe 2 decades later, roughly, if even that much, when Paul wrote this. And even by the end of 68, 69 AD, depending on where you put Peter's death at, it was clearly evident that there were those trying, willingly and intentionally trying to cause divisions within a local church. Someone mentioned it a while ago, and it might have been Seth, that if a false teacher comes up and knocks on the church's door and says, "Hey, let me have your pulpit for 2 hours," the elders say no. That's not how you attack a church. You attack a congregation from within. And in order to do that, people have to come in unawares, do this, and the end result's the same thing that we're looking at here in 1 Corinthians 11. Matter of fact, we'll get farther down in our text. Some of the brethren were spiritually dead. And so we'll talk more about that. good comments there. Good points.
Well, and I mean, you don't have to go far into the church's history of existence. You get to Acts 6, there's already divisions where people are being left out because of their ethnicity within that. So, those things were present, and not necessarily seeming like a false teacher situation in Acts 6, but you see that as a problem early on.
That's right. That's right. I do want to clarify something. I had to do this for the adult Bible. Well, I didn't have to do it for the adult Bible class. It just struck me as odd what I heard. One Sunday morning, there were a couple of really good comments that were made, and so I made a few comments about those comments. And I said those were really good comments. I'm not talking about my comments. I'm talking about the comments that were made. So, yeah, if you make comments and I make comments, I say those are good comments. I'm talking about your comments, not my comments. So, not
Good
quite
comment.
that narcissistic.
Good comment, Paul. Or John. Good comment.
Thanks, Tom. All right, well, let's go ahead now and step on into verse 20. Verse 20 really begins to highlight, not really highlight the problem, but it highlights the result of the problem. The problem here is divisions, it's factions, but the specific area that he's addressing is seen within the observance of the Lord's Supper and their attitudes towards it. So let's start reading there in verse 20, and I know we read this a while ago, but let's read again 20 through 22, and let's see. Seth, you've got that up. Why don't you go ahead and read those 3 verses for us?
All right. Verse 20, starting there, it says, "Therefore, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in eating, each one takes his own supper ahead of others. One is hungry and another is drunk. What? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I do not praise you."
All righty, thank you, Seth. And take notice here for a moment what he says in verse 20. He makes the point that when they were coming together, he says, when you come together into one place, and this is the same coming together we see earlier, you come together not for the better, but for the worse. He tells them that it's not to eat the Lord's Supper. Now, to me and you, based on his descriptions within verses 20 and 21, he's clearly telling them you don't come together to have a common meal. You don't come together to sit down and eat and laugh and be the first ones to grab it, and some have, some don't have. You just keep on drinking until you're drunk. I mean, he's clearly establishing for them that this is not a common meal that they are to be observing. Very simple, very straightforward. And in 21, he says, in eating, one takes his own supper ahead of others. In our day and time, if we're going to talk about proper etiquette, you're not supposed to start eating until everybody is seated at the table, all right, and the food is properly distributed. Then everybody can begin to eat. We're not always properly etiquettely established, but he's clearly showing them that this was not a common meal, that there was more to this than simply the way that they were looking at it. Do you think that maybe we are right in presuming that they had turned the Lord's Supper into an actual feast, into a weekly common social meal?
Right.
Well, yeah, I think what's happening is what they're practicing is them intending to be the Lord's Supper. As if I'm holding up this pen right here and somebody says, "That's a chicken." That's what I mean it to be. You're like, well, it's not a chicken. Hate to be the bearer of bad news. So the meal you're partaking of, Corinthians, you may be trying to do the Lord's Supper. That may be your attempt, but here's the reasons why it's not the Lord's Supper. And then it goes on to say that what you're doing is not just a common meal. Let's not mistake that either. That's not his only attacking point, because even if it was a common meal, he'd have problems with it because they're getting drunk and they're not being considerate, so there would be sins involved even if it was a common meal that they were trying to do. So I think that they're trying to do the Lord's Supper, but they're obviously not doing it correctly, and that's the problem that Paul has, and he's going to list several reasons as to why that is the case.
And we need to be careful not to read first century, our century problems into the text and try to apply our mentality into it. What the real problem is their selfishness, that they're taking something special, making it common. They're eating, they're not waiting on each other, and the real problem is their hearts and their selfishness. All sin is selfishness. What they're doing is they're taking something that should be helping them focus on holy things, and they're making it to be more selfish. They're taking it and something that should be for their good, and they're making it be for their worse. They're becoming more selfish when they partake of the Lord's Supper instead of becoming closer together, the communion that Lord's Supper is supposed to be, and it's dividing them rather than unifying them.
All right, well, Eric, let me throw this question to you then, along the lines of what Seth was pointing out. I think it's a very good comment, Seth. Do you think that the modern-day denominations and some churches of Christ that push a worship experience is effectively working with the same mentality as the Corinthians were? As far as it's all about us, it's what we want, what we can get out of it?
Yes, I think maybe that's highlighted here in this contrast. And the question is, whose supper are they eating? And he says in verse 20, it's not the Lord's. And he says in verse 21, everybody's doing his own thing. It had become focused on the experience, I guess, of the worshiper. So even not only were they not considering each other, but they weren't considering the Lord, as he reminds them, in a few verses later, that if you don't discern or you set aside in your mind and focus on the real purpose of this, and you make it all about yourself, then we get back up to the problem that you mentioned, in the opening verse. You're actually doing more harm than good when you come together. I think you're right.
Yeah, that's really what strikes me as interesting when and I've even seen some brethren within the local congregation. Years ago, this one family stood up at the end of service, the husband did at least, and said, we're going to be moving our membership to such and such congregation because we just don't feel like we are getting here what we need. And it's not about what we get. I mean, there is a measure of edification, we understand that. But when we do all that we can possibly be doing and working with the local church and worshiping God, we're going to be edified. When we become caught up in what we want, then we begin to define what is acceptable, and we have this problem right here.
And really, what I hear from you guys is this, is that these were human beings selfishly, sinfully, and commonly celebrating an act in history that was the most unselfish act, that was the most unique act, and that was the most sinless act ever in human history. But they're celebrating in a way that would be contrary to everything that the act they're attempting to celebrate represented or was done with.
And to add to that, Daniel, it was the single most unifying act that had ever occurred in history, and now they're dividing. They're causing divisions with it.
We've got a comment we're going to bring up here in the chat room in just a moment. Let me go ahead and kind of bring us down to verse 22 because I think the comment from Randy will work very well with this. To me, when he says, what, do you not have houses to eat and drink in, or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What we're looking at here is a behavior that belongs or that would be seen within a home, a social setting, and not within the worship of the church. And so when he says, do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing, I would take away from that if we allow ourselves to turn what should be a worship service into a social occasion, then we despise the church of God. Paul is away for a moment, so I think he's got us on automatic, which means that you'll need to read the chat room starting, where you have it.
All right, I've got it already pulled up. Mr. Randall said, look at today how false brethren look at this verse. They say Paul wasn't condemning eating social meals in the building. He was condemning their hospitality. They twist this very text to their own destruction when it is very plainly teaching that it is wrong to have a social meal as a work of the church. Social meals are the work of the home and not a work of the church. They were trying to give the work of the home to the work of the church. We need to keep the works of the home in the home and the works of the church in the church. This is exactly what is happening in the house church movement. They want to make the Lord's Supper part of a common meal and focus it on the feelings of the people instead of the focus of God. They've turned it into a social service instead of a worship service, just like the Corinthians. They make the Lord's Supper a sub-part of the meal instead of the reason for the meal.
I think that's a very good comment, Randall, and I think he hits the nail right on the head. There's a local Church of Christ not too far from our meeting place, probably 4 miles, maybe 5 miles. And I've talked with a preacher there on one occasion, and the congregation has ties, if you would, with Oklahoma Christian and the subsequent institutional congregations here in Edmond area. But he was talking to me one time about he went to some lecture they had at OC and how liberally minded the speaker was. So he and I were kind of talking about that, and I gathered that he is very sound. It's just that he was raised up with the idea of it being acceptable to have a kitchen and a fellowship hall and to have fellowship meals within the building. I mean, everything else, dancing, marriage, forced remarriage, and drinking, all the other stuff, straight across the board, as far as I know, right in line with the Scriptures, understanding authority. So much so that he kind of told me, well, I can kind of see your position on why y'all don't have a kitchen, but I was just raised with it. The problem is that anything that you open the door to that leads the church in a direction opposing what Jesus has taught is going to bring danger upon the church. I might try to say, well, what's the harm in opening up the foyer one Sunday, set up our tables, and let us set up, bring crock pots, and one Sunday, the special Sunday, have a meal. And one person may try to argue, well, there's nothing wrong with that unless you continue doing it. And that's where the problem is. As soon as you open the door one time, then it leads to another. And at some point, you now, and someone says, no, you're saying it's going to go worse than what it ever does. No, look at the congregations that are being built today, buildings that are being built, and you got to have a kitchen. I mean, nowadays, in the eyes of many churches of Christ, you've got to have a kitchen. Why? The very thing that Randall was talking about. It's the church's responsibility now, they say, to provide for the social well-being of the younger members especially. And it takes the church away, and it's that simple. It takes the church away from what God designed the local congregation, the local church to be. Any thoughts?
Absolutely.
I've got a question for you guys about this, because this gets brought up sometimes when, especially the very topic you're discussing. And clearly he's not saying Christians can only eat in their homes. I mean, you could eat other places. And they could eat together. And if someone happened to be meeting in a home, they could worship, and then, I assume at some point after that they would end up eating together, maybe at the same look. So really, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like if we go back to verse 17, it was when they came together for worship. And that was the purpose of that coming together. And what they had done was corrupt that with these other things that were the work of the home and, to be done kind of elsewhere outside of that purpose. And is that so? Really, the problem that they had was not that they were eating together, and it wasn't, those kinds of things. It wasn't really even where they were eating. It was a matter that they had brought into this assembly that was supposed to be remembering Jesus and his death, and then turned it into something else.
Right. Yeah. One of the arguments, if I understand this correctly, and I read a little bit on it, arguing in favor of this Lord's Supper in the midst of a common meal is the fact that Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper in the midst of the Passover meal.
Which was not a common meal, by the way. But go ahead.
But it was a meal. It was not. Oh no, it was very established and very orderly and involved certain things exactly. But what they're I think that's the argument today, is that because they were eating and Jesus took the elements in the midst of that, that's what we're supposed to do. I think I'm wondering if maybe that was the mindset of the Corinthians as Paul is writing to them. And Paul basically shuts that down here, and he reminds them that the Lord's Supper is not a common meal. It's not about being a common meal at all. You need to completely separate it. You don't need to put the setting of taking the Lord's Supper in the exact same setting in which Jesus took it. In the midst of that common meal, or not common, but in the midst of having a meal. Mm-hmm. And that's the point that Paul is doing. He is completely separating and saying what Jesus instituted as an act of worship is simply the partaking of the unleavened bread and the cup, and not in a full capacity, or a filling capacity.
And going back off, Eric's comments, up to verse 16, that when you come together as a congregation, that this is what he's talking about. And so he's distinguishing the role of the congregation from the role of the individual. And so, he's saying, when do you not have houses to eat and drink in, he's establishing that this is not what you come together as a congregation for. You can come together as individuals for this act, that's fine. Nobody disputes that. But when you come together as a congregation, and that is your function, as we are, for instance here, the Leeward Church of Christ, this is what we're doing, this is our action, this is our work, this is our duty, this is our goal, this is what we're supporting, etc., that just simply the social meals don't have a role within that function.
Right. I think that's a very good point. We have to be careful how far, and this goes back to what Eric was saying, we have to be careful how far we try to use this verse to rule out certain things. This passage is talking about an abuse of the worship service. And Tom, I'm going to comment on something you just said. My position, my thoughts is not that they were remembering the Passover. I wonder if they were being influenced by some of their idolistic pasts. Coming from, idol, because in chapter 10, he said you can't eat from the table of the Lord and the table of idols. And so I wonder if they were trying to turn the Lord's Supper into some feast that they used to observe in years ago when they worshipped idols.
Right.
That's a possibility as well. Because you think about it, they didn't have a church building. They had a meeting place. Maybe someone's house, maybe a rented facility. It wasn't about where they met. It was about what they were doing when they met to worship God. I remember I've come across a few preachers in my past who would frown strongly upon a mother giving her 1-year-old or 18-month-old Fruit Loops because that's eating in the church building. I've got evidence that I had Arby's here at the building. And there are some who would say, no, you can't eat in the building because Paul says you're supposed to eat at home. We have to be careful how far we try to make this apply
yes.
to the context.
And I think that's what we can do a better job as preachers. Instead of making the issue eating in the building, make the issue exactly what it is, as social meals are not a work of the congregation. And right. the reason we don't want to do those things in the building is the same reason we don't have birthday parties in the building, which is the same reason we don't have basketball games in the building, because the things that are done in the building are associated with the work of the congregation when they're done by the individuals of the congregation in those senses. So.
And in addition to that, we haven't got there yet, and I'm sorry for jumping ahead, but in verse 34 he says, if you're hungry, eat at home. And I think he's making the point that this spiritual sharing together and communion that they had, the table of the Lord, the cup of the Lord that we bless, and those things, the purpose of that was not for filling the belly, as someone's already mentioned, but that eating to satisfy hunger is the separate activity from this remembrance and memorial meal, and that's important too, because one of you mentioned already that some of the the discussions that are in the kind of current events. And in F. LaGard Smith's book, Radical Restoration, he kind of ridicules the pinch and sift culture, as he refers to it. And there's people who advocate that really you can't do this unless for some reason you have large quantities of bread and a big glass of beverage, and otherwise you're not really doing it. But even in this very context, Paul clarified that the purpose of this eating and drinking was not to satisfy physical hunger, but was to remember and discern and to focus on sacrifice.
That's right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. Very good point.
We've got several comments too in the chat.
Let's see. Seth, do you want to bring those in, starting? We read Randall's comment, and Paul makes a distinction, didn't we?
No, that's where
I don't think so. I think the one right before that was where we left off.
Yeah, that's where we're at.
Exactly what is happening. That we read that one. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's start with Randall's. Paul makes a distinction comment, and let's just take each one of these and kind of bring the chat room up, or get caught up with the chat room, I should say.
Okay. Paul makes a distinction that they should not be eating a social meal at this specific location, which apparently is not a house that also serves as a place to meet. I've also heard ignorant people say that you can't eat at a restaurant, only at home. No, Paul is distinguishing between the two works here, the works of the home and the works of the church. You back those people off and ask them, what are the works of the church, and where do social works fit in the works of the church? They don't. We have to focus on what are the works of the church and what are the works of the home. When we do that, it eliminates all emotional arguments, and it is just like the MDR arguments. If you just get back to the basics and teach what the Bible teaches, you eliminate all the emotional what-ifs. The other question is, can the church funds be used to fund social meals?
All right, let's pause there for just a moment before we continue.
The answer is no.
It's not the point of this text at all.
Yeah.
And that's right. That is kind of a separate question that stems off from a misunderstanding. Not Randall doesn't have a misunderstanding, but a misunderstanding of the context has already been mentioned. I had years ago at a congregation where we didn't have elders, just men's business meeting. We didn't have many young people at all. One man who had a teenage daughter in the business meeting said this church needs to have more activities for our young people. And so I raised my hand. I said, wait a minute. That's the responsibility of the homes. If you want your kid to play with other kids, invite those kids over to your house, or help someone else invite them over to their house. It's not the church's work to provide that for your children. It is your responsibility. So subsequently, the funds that we take up together on the first day of the week is for the purpose of the work of the local church, which does not include paying for the kids to go to Six Flags.
Agreed.
Go ahead. Yeah.
All right. Brian says, the key to this passage seems to be the statement, when you come together as a church, which defines the coming together as the work of the church. Randall says, there's a difference between incidental things and the planned and purpose social events at the building. It's called preaching and educating your mind. LaGard Smith is a false teacher, and his book has done more harm to this subject than any other brethren before him. He is the father of this modern-day feel-good movement in the church.
And I think his father was a conservative preacher. At least that's what I heard one time. That's what I'd been told.
Well, so was F. LaGard, if I understand correctly.
And I mean, when we do come together as a church, when our services are over, conversations do vary to where are we going to go eat, what happened at the last sporting event, about the weather, about things that are happening in our own lives, and we do talk to each other. There are social things that do happen in buildings. We do have conversations and such, but those aren't works of the church. There is a line that we cross when we are setting up programs to just for social things and making those part of the work of the church.
And that's the difference that, just to expound, I know exactly where my dad was talking about between incidental matters versus things that are planned and sponsored events. Like a baby eating Cheerios, for instance. You didn't bring the baby to services so he could eat Cheerios. That's not why you brought the baby to services. When you're talking about the weather after services, you didn't go, you know what, I'm going to wake up today, I'm going to go sit through this hour of worship service because I really want to talk to Brother So-and-so about the weather. That wasn't the reason that you came to service. If so, that's a problem in and of itself. But,
Right.
those are the attitude, is what we're addressing here is that why are you coming together? And even the Corinthians in this specific situation were coming together for the wrong reasons, and that made everything they did wrong. And so we can take care to come together for the right reasons that God has instructed us to do so.
Well, I tell you what, let's plan to close it on that thought, Daniel. And we'll have to resume this next week with verse 23. But let me say this based on what Randall said. Paul is addressing a specific issue that resulted in the abuse of the Lord's Supper and subsequently the weakness of the brethren there. But let me tell you, going back to what Daniel said, you kind of said no one's going to go to church to talk to someone about the weather. But you know what? If we go to the assemblies for other reasons rather than worshiping the Lord, we're just as wrong. I have known some Christians who will pick a church and visit there because of their business contacts. Because they haven't tried to sell their product to anybody there. They've got more people, and so there'll be more fun activities afterwards for their children. I mean, if you're not going for the reasons so stated within the Word of God, but for some other reasons and motives, then you're no different than the Corinthians.
Mm-hmm.
So just we kind of make a more broader application of that.
Absolutely.
Well, what say you want to begin next Wednesday at verse 23?
Sounds good.
Works for me.
All right, let's go ahead and see if there's any final thoughts or comments. Let's start with you, Seth and Eric.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you for allowing me to come and study with you guys again, and everyone who is in the chat room and who may be watching this at a later date. As always, if there's anything that we said, please contact us. Let us know. And who knows, we may have changed our mind by the time you watch this. We want to get things right. So if you have something that's different than what we've said today, please contact us, and because we want to follow what is true. Thank you very much for having me on today. I appreciate it.
Eric?
Thanks for allowing me to jump in. I'm glad that Seth told me about the study. I didn't even know you guys did this, and some of you, I guess most of you guys I don't know, other than I know Daniel through Facebook, and it's good to be able to meet you guys through this medium, and maybe I'll be able to join in again in the future.
Yeah, we'd definitely love to have you back. We have different situations arise where one or two of us have to bow out for a particular week, and we're always looking for willing people who would like to have their name marked down on something that someone may write them up for later. So, I appreciate it, Eric. Daniel, any thoughts?
Just thank everyone for their time, and appreciate your study, and we hope you continue to study these things, and appreciate you finding it an important part of your morning or afternoon, wherever you are at, or evening. Maybe you're watching this at a different time, and decided to study God's Word. That's always a good use of time, and we commend you for that, and hope you keep on studying. And if you have any questions, you can always contact us at our email addresses below. So thank you.
Absolutely. Paul?
Well, I missed a large portion of the study today. I really apologize for that. I got a call from a brother, and we needed to talk, and it was an important spiritual matter, and something with the local work here that I just needed to do. But I'm glad that you've joined us today. I will go back and read through the chat transcript, and also try to watch the study so that I'm prepared for next time. Thanks for joining us today. Tom?
All right, Tom.
Yeah, I echo what everybody else has said. One quick comment that I did want to make about our context in verse 20 is when Paul made the statement there, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. He is implying in that text that we ought to come together to eat the Lord's Supper. And so let's just keep that in mind, and thank you everybody for your comments and everything that you say, and look forward to next week when we continue studying how the Lord's Supper is to be partaken of.
Absolutely. Okay. Throw it back to the source here. He will. We want to thank everyone who commented in the chat room. We appreciate all your comments. They were greatly helpful in our discussion today. Continue doing that. If you are watching this at a later time, as Seth talked about a while ago, you want to contact us, you can contact most of us at truthfactor.com. Daniel at, Tom at, Paul at, or John at truthfactor.com, or you can write your questions at truthfactor.com as well. We may talk with Eric and see, or Seth, and see if he'd want to have a personalized, free Seth at truthfactor.com email address, so he can get hate mail as well. Actually, we don't. Thing is, we don't receive much email. So either folks who are watching this later, and I know folks are watching this later because of the counts on the YouTube page, they haven't felt the need to write to us yet. So you can do that if you would like. And we'd be happy to bring your thoughts into our discussion for sure. All righty, I guess that brings us to another end of another study. As they say, this one is in the can. Let's go ahead and pull it to a close. We invite you to join us again next Wednesday at 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time.
That's noon Eastern Time.
9 o'clock Pacific Time.
Or 6 a.m. Hawaii time.
Right here at live.truthfactor.com. Have a wonderful week.